Let's see, the actual title. Where am I? Oh yeah, Father's Day, the masculine principle of God. Now, if you will recall, on Mother's Day, I spoke about the feminine principle of God. And always we try to show the special picture that has been taught from time immemorial in, by, and through the Kabbalah, which is really that basic background of the hidden wisdom of Israel, from which come the true methods for attaining higher levels of consciousness in our Western cultures. Now, whenever we discuss masculine principle and feminine principle, we really should be looking at the tree of life, the same tree of life, incidentally, that's mentioned in Genesis and been misunderstood by those who made literal translations. It would be similar to, though not, of course, the same, it would be similar to the idea that if some thousands or millions of years hence, some very advanced beings saw our comic books, they would get a very extraordinary idea about us, wouldn't they? If they literally interpreted something that we meant as josh and fun. I particularly, of course, refer to some of these cartoons that have a biting edge and yet are so clever. Still, there would be very extraordinary misinterpretation of what the culture was. And indeed, there would be very wise philosophers who would point out that a very special cult, a very superstitious group of people, probably made the most tremendous to-do about various functions that the cartoons point up as being vital or not. I will leave to your imagination. You look at the cartoons and you'll see what kind of crazy things might develop out of it, and misinterpretations as well as misunderstandings. Now then, in the Bible, and unfortunately it isn't only the Bible which our Western culture has had as its guide in so many ways, really the spiritual books of various groups have had the same problem, a need to interpret, and indeed an inability to interpret in any other way except from their own present limitation. And to show you what the limitation can involve in masculine and feminine principles, if you just go down the line, wherever you are, where you work or in your neighborhood, and take just the men and then just the women and ask them very simple questions, like you might say to all the men, what do you think of women? Well, there would be some interesting remarks and reactions, wouldn't there? And another question, do you think women are superior or inferior to man? Now that would be a very leading one, wouldn't it? And, yes. And questions like, do you think God made a mistake in creating woman out of your rib? And questions like, do you trust woman? And then questions like, well, even if you don't trust her, are you dependent on woman? You know, you get a very interesting bunch of answers. Maybe they'll be asked you at the party in subtle ways where you don't recognize it. And then take a bunch of women and go down the line where you work, in the neighborhood, wherever they are, ask them the same kind of question except in relation to man. Do you trust man? Do you think man is superior or inferior to woman? Do you think God made a mistake in creating Adam? Should he have just stuck with Eve? Would you trust a man in financial matters or in fidelities and so on and so on? Do you realize how many answers you would get? And do you realize that all the answers would be telling you just one thing? The thing I remind you about so often, and that is when whenever any of us open our mouths, there's just one thing we're really telling anybody else, even though we may not realize it or know it. It's like that cute little takeoff on consciousness in relation to the fact that people don't recognize what they are really expressing so often, and that's true of both men and women. And it is, quote, "Don't look now, but your consciousness is showing." You know, that's the takeoff on the slip. And slip it is, you know. But people don't recognize this. So, you have a very ridiculous kind of development in humanity, and this is true of all humanity. It doesn't matter where they are. You can go to the Australian Aborigines, you can go to the most sophisticated societies, you can go to the Hottentots, and you can go to the most primitive cannibals amongst the Polynesian or other groups. And there's one thing you'll find all over the world, and it's really an extraordinary thing. All women will assure the questioner that men need improving and how. And all men will be saying the same thing in their own way, except that with men, they'll also look very mystified, whereas you will not have as much mystification in the eyes of women as you will in the eyes of men when they are stating pretty much the same thing, one about the other. Now, why should this be so? Why indeed? Well, for one thing, when we listen to or read the story in the Bible, which, remember, is a mystical allegory that refers to creation in its largest and deepest sense, when you read this allegory, you have interpretations of it that are extraordinarily other than they were originally meant when given by the wise men, as I've mentioned before, mainly because you have so many mistranslations, because you can't translate accurately from one language to another to get subtleties of consciousness across, unless you have a thorough ability to think and feel in both languages. And you know this is very rare. So that most of us, if we learn another language, and rather late in life, and do not practice it, we may give literal translations to words, but those subtle meanings that are underlying are missed. And so everything we read that comes from the wisdom literature in the English language, basically, has had this unhappy kind of development, that we read something that wasn't really said. What we are reading is somebody's consciousness showing. In other words, the translators translating for a particular king or monarch or ruler of that period, or a particular church, and therefore taking certain wisdom teachings and showing the consciousness of the group as they want it to be understood, even though that understanding may be erroneous. Well then, when we talk about masculine principle and feminine principle, we must understand that we do have a very serious situation in this world, And it exists only with human beings, except also, I think, black widow spiders. You know, they do a very mean thing. Imagine eating their husbands after the husbands have been so loving to them. I mean, after all, that's not nice. They're making very bad karma. But, as I said, outside of the black widow spiders, I think only human beings have the same tendency, that is, a destructive tendency, towards each other in terms of the masculine and feminine principles. And you know, this is kind of foolish, really. It is utterly foolish, but of course, humanity is very foolish. It's part of our charm, don't you think? But the foolishness is really a stage of growth. We haven't recognized the real significance of the masculine and feminine principle, mainly because we have not yet recognized that everything that exists is an expression of deities, either in the masculine and or feminine aspect, but always the one indicates the other. Always. When you have an atom, which is supposed to be, at least one of the most basic units in the building up of physical matter, and now, of course, they're recognizing more and more smaller units in what they call the nucleus of the atom, you know. But even there, they discover you have the positive and the negative. And of course, I always resented the word negative to the feminine principle, mainly because I'm a woman. But after a while, when I started to re-examine and made up my mind that after all, since everybody else in the world interprets in terms of their consciousness, I'll just think of it as the magnetic pulling center of God, whereas the masculine principle is the electrical pushing or projecting center. And after all, you can't project unless there's something to receive and pull, in fact to stir it, and vice versa. There's no use pulling and receiving magnetically unless there's something projecting. This is true in every field of the universe. It's true in terms of the atom, and then they capture each other. You know, that sounds exciting, like caveman days, doesn't it? You know, there are certain atoms, if they're missing an electron, they don't like it. And you know, they do a very, very unethical thing. They reach out and they grab an electron from another passing atom. Honest. And they incorporate it, and then they're called stable or unstable, depending on what it was to begin with. And the figures, if they're unstable, they're going to grab somebody else's electron, you know. And God knows what that atom feels. You know, I guess they feel cheated. And I said, well, I like that extra electron around me. I don't think it was right of you to take that away from me. So you see, you have these problems with the negatives and the positives right down to your atomic structure. And so why should we be surprised when we find it in the complexity of the most highly evolved group of atoms, form-wise, when we find it in humanity in its most intensive form? We therefore have from the Bible, and if you men don't think I'm going to rave about you, you wait, you'll see. I'm leading up to it, you know, because when you walk out of the temple today, I want you to command and demand of every woman that they bow to you as a masculine principle. Today, at least. After that, you can go back to your other arguments. Might as well start the seed sometime. And of course, you see, when we chuckle together, you realize how we release tensions that help us to really love and worship these extraordinary principles, which we cannot at all fully comprehend, but we can certainly grow towards it more and more as we use these principles properly and work towards our comprehension. All right, then. We have in Genesis the story of the creation of Adam. Now, I've got to bring this in so that we can see how a misrepresentation or a mistranslation by people who intended a certain attitude or a certain kind of influence, who really, it's kind of plain lying, isn't it? You know, that's naughty. We should never lie unless it's a white lie. Nevertheless, we do have a deliberate misrepresentation here from groups who, either sincerely or insincerely, and perhaps both, gave us a completely erroneous attitude towards our spiritual aspirations and heritage in the story of the creation of Adam. Because Adam, as anyone knows who even takes a little time to investigate the original texts, Adam does not mean man as just you men who we adore and honor and worship today even more than ever, though I believe it should be done all the time. I think you're wonderful. And I hope you think you're wonderful. At least I'm going to try to help you think so. But Adam in Kabbalah means generic humanity, you see, and generic humanity is man and woman. And Eve in Kabbalah doesn't mean woman, basically, as such. It means physical manifestation. And so when Adam wants to keep blaming Eve, you know, for being tempted by the serpent and causing all this ruckus and problem and trouble, I mean, after all, was it a male or a female aspect of Adam, that is generic humanity, who first got that enamored with the serpent? All right. Now, again, we have to understand what serpent means in Kabbalah and occultism. Serpent, and I'm going to shock you very much, and incidentally, deliberately. You know, shock treatment helps us to grow and expand our consciousness better than anything. Serpent, in Kabbalah and in all occultism, is referred to at times as Kundalini energy. It is actually the reproductive energy. In other words, the sex drive. Isn't that shocking? Cute, see? That's right, it isn't. Not at all. In other words, the reproductive energy is the serpent energy. And the reproductive energy that, shall we say, tempted Adam to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil really has a very simple meaning. The reproductive drive of the Son, S-O-N, of God, Adam, generic humanity, became so strong because of the fact that, after all, it is made of its own divine Father, divine Mother essence, became so strong that the drive, the need to become conscious, individualized, brought about a recognition of the pairs of opposites. And pairs of opposites has to do with being conscious. In other words, you would not know darkness if you didn't have light, and you wouldn't know light if you didn't have darkness. You couldn't know one color from another if you didn't have other colors and complementaries in colors. You couldn't know love, which is coming togetherness, if you hadn't gone through hate, which is ignorance and separateness. You couldn't know union with God if you hadn't known separation of feeling lost and alone, an isolated, selfish unit of God, locked away. In other words, it is in and through experiencing the pairs of opposites that consciousness becomes evolved, that individuality evolves, and of course, we stumble and fall and have stumbled and fallen in an attempt to become accustomed to the various gradations of light and darkness and to understand them and then finally to control them. So your whole story in Genesis relating to Adam and Eve is from our own Western mystery tradition, at least 6,000 years old, in which, in an allegorical form, we're given the whole principle of creation as it very specifically relates to the evolution of consciousness itself. And within that realm, within that, so-called positive, so-called negative, within that electric projecting, outpouring to the magnetic inpulling. And you have to have the both to have anything, remember. There is nothingness except you have your pairs of opposites. And that is why in Kabbalah, that one, that indivisible, the divine name, and remember every divine name is of the one God, it's just that one God functioning on a specific level or vibratory field of awareness for us to become attuned to. You'll understand that more in our Monday night practices after we get singing like I want us to. But this one, this indivisible, whose vibratory formula and power is called Ahaya, actually, remember, in Kabbalah, creation starts because that one starts another cycle of activity which begins a whirling motion, and so in Kabbalah it's called the beginning of the whirlings. And the beginning of the whirlings, if we can see it in the heavens, the nebulas, the solar systems, the atoms with their electrons, these are all whirlings. And you know what makes everything whirl? Well, I don't know if I can put the idea across, but I'm going to try. The reason everything in the universe whirls is because the masculine divine principle, the cosmic father, projects out this infinite, never-ending power. And the other half of God, the divine masculine feminine principle, called Elohim or Bina or Ima, takes this projecting outward into herself, and we call it a phenomena occurring in space, or somebody getting pregnant. The same principle takes place in the vastnesses as it does in the infinite smallnesses, if we could call it that. The divine feminine draws magnetically this energy, and by drawing it, it forms a matrix. Because if, as our scientists tell us, if anything projected by the masculine energy didn't have something to grab it back, that's why men feel are mistreated by women, incidentally. You can take this into psychology too, and you must, because one principle shows up another, and we're out to develop an understanding and insight together here. But you see, if this masculine energy just went pouring out, there'd be no such thing as circular motion, there'd be no such thing as form. And even our Einstein mathematics, of which I know nothing, but I'll bet our mathematical boy, my spiritual son there, that gorgeous John, I bet he understands it. I'll have to have him explain it to me sometime. Not that I'll understand it, but my spirit will. But this, even the Einsteinian explanation in terms of mass of the universe does seem to indicate that everything, I can just give you the principle as I see it in my own inner soul, you see, and then I leave it to our gorgeous men to prove it, because they're the boys who do it. They're wonderful. Now they, you see, projecting outwards, if there was nothing that held it in, stopped it cold, brought it back to a stable, kind of compressive influence, you'd have nothing happening at all except things going all over the lot. And as I think I've mentioned to you before, it's been found in psychological studies that men, if they're alone together, they do go wilder and wilder. You know, you might call it energy gone wild. And woman is the taming principle of energy. The feminine part of God latches on. Now, don't you go calling your wife names, boys. That's your treasure. She latches on to this energy and multiplies it for the man. Now, this is true of the cosmic principle, as well as in its various other levels and forms. And, of course, that part of man, which has this extraordinary compulsive outdrive electrically, finding even in an unconscious way, sometimes it's too conscious, like, you know, this joke, woman with a rolling pin to hit her husband over the head if he comes home late. Hey, I haven't got a rolling pin. Thank you. You look at that sweet man as though I'd need it. Maybe we have other kinds of ways to roll the energies around. Anyway, this energy that pours out so compulsively, and by compulsive, believe me, I'm not saying anything against men. I think it's glorious. Look at all this vital power the masculine force keeps distributing more and more into the universe. Then the feminine power takes this projection of vital energy, draws it inward, and because it has the tendency to want to keep going, and yet all the time the feminine principle, and I tell you, the feminine principle is cunning. Boys, watch out. Be on guard. It won't help you, but it'll make it more interesting. Now, this feminine principle, you see, grabs this energy and keeps pulling, and she does it so steadily and subtly. Now, some people would say cunning, but that's not as nice a word. Let's say subtly, firmly, and with great ingenuity. Doesn't that sound prettier? No, we have to rave about the men today. Excuse me, let's call it cunning if you like. Make you feel happier? Anyway, whichever thing we call it, there's this continuous drawing of the masculine power towards itself, and because the masculine power continues refeeding and projecting with this tremendous intensity of its outpouring energy. That's true of you as men, every one of you individually, as well as the principle as a whole in God, you know. So we're talking about you boys. And, you know, this fabulous power you have, whether you know it or not. And the fabulous power the feminine half has, which you've got to understand if you're going to learn how to keep being taken advantage of so much in certain psychological areas. And I'm going to give you some good hints. And if the girls are going to scold me later, that's all right. Then I'll give them hints about how to do things in reverse, but all for a constructive purpose, for love and constructive awakening together in a true unity of spirit. All right, now this continuous outpouring of the male with the continuous inpulling of the female, and this is a principle everywhere, you can see how that would start form something that's more or less round, can't you? It keeps trying to get away, and it's being pulled back. Get away, pulled back. So instead of going all the way out in a straight line, I hope, can you see it as a picture? It finally, you know, it then keeps, that's the motion that keeps drawing it around, and then suddenly you have something that looks like a circle. And that's why in Kabbalah they talk about the beginning of the whirlings. And you see everywhere in the biggest cosmos, in the nebula, you see in the smallest thing like the atom, you see these apparent whirlings of motion. All of it really is the essence or substance of God being manipulated by the masculine driving power of God in this way, that that which drives and wills is God the Father, and you are God the Father, every one of you who are men, and every masculine flower and every masculine creature is a certain area or level of this compulsive outpour, this will, this drive to give. Did you know men are more generous than women? Really. They have, on the whole, a compulsion to outdrive as a principle of God. But then, do you know women are more form-sustaining than men, because they have the compulsion to feed and nourish in order to reproduce this very male drive and energy. So you see, one without the other is nothing, nothing at all. Whether you're married or not, whether you have a boyfriend and or a girlfriend or not, the principle is, and it exists in the deepest part of our souls, from the greatest vastnesses to the so-called smallnesses. And within this principle, we have a true guide if we only try to understand it and work with the tarot to transmute our misconceptions that have come from a level other than the true wisdom teaching. In other words, the serpent power then is the driving reproductive power. And this driving reproductive power really, if you want to go to masculine and feminine, you can blame the masculine part of God as symbolized by Adam, because the masculine force is much more driving outward compulsive in the reproductive elements than is the female, you know. The female has to be a lot more choosy, because after all, the female's going to take this seed and grow it inside her own being. So she can't be as wild in the basic driving principle. This whole protective, indrawing, nurturing and nourishing element is so vital in order to bring about the continuous evolution of all humanity, that naturally, if the female had the same compulsiveness in an outdriving as the male, we'd have nothing existing at all. And so we have the female taking this wild drive of the male right on down the line. You can see it in every area, from so-called non-animate matter, really, to the highest complex forms. You see the female as always working with far more of a discriminating element. Even women who are not discriminating, they're learning how, because women suffer the repercussions of indiscriminate reception. Whereas the masculine principle also, he suffers his repercussions in this way, that he finds he doesn't much get anywhere unless he's got a feminine principle or has evolved to the point of capturing with his outgoing. Actually, she captures him, you know, but he likes to feel that he captured her. This is part of the delight of games in reverse. Can't you see that the very principle, if the masculine principle is projecting out, and the feminine principle, just universally speaking, takes this energy and starts drawing it, so you have this compression that actually forms physical matter and the motion of suns and planets. Can't you see that really the feminine principle captures the masculine? And that's why man is upset with woman. He thinks it's a dirty shame to have been captured. It would be nicer to have been all free, going in all directions at once. That is, with his conscious mind, but not with his subconscious mind. His subconscious mind knows that to evolve more and more individuality and that extraordinary creative ability that really mostly the masculine principle has brought that to our planet, like being able to get onto the moon and things like that. In order for him to have that, he has had to have this drawing principle that captures the energy and sort of goads him into compressing it into creative forms, or having his creation compressed into forms, which after all then are his children. So you can see that the feminine principle serves a purpose for the masculine principle that's a lot broader than perhaps we've realized. And in order to truly understand the masculine principle of God, we have to see that there is an eternal and beginningless and endless source of a driving energy, a need to give of self. Men really have a better love nature than women, though women don't believe it. But I've mentioned this before. Not that anyone has a better. Let's say men have more of an idealism in regard to their love nature once they've evolved to the level. And that's the crux of the matter. Once man has evolved to the level of truly loving principles as well as just direct things of the moment, man idealizes woman far more readily than woman has been able to idealize man, and this is one of the things that's wrong with our society today. And it has brought about some very negative reactions, which I want all of you men in this temple to fight. And I mean to fight it constructively. And I want every woman in this temple to start seeing a man properly. Not that we don't have unevolved and less evolved and more evolved in both men and women, but you see, it necessitates a certain level of evolution in both a man and a woman to attract each other. That is, for a man who's achieved an ability and capacity to really keep utilizing this energy to bring in this infinite source of projective energy that he has directly as an aspect of God the Father, the cosmic masculine principle. To do this, what he requires is a mate, a true mate, a woman, who is there to draw this energy magnetically into concentrated forms that will build back to him and for him more and more power. In other words, in tarot key number 3, the Empress. Now that's pregnant woman. It's the cosmic mother principle, and it is the principle in every female, no matter whether she's considered low or high. Just in some it hasn't grown up yet. It may need many incarnations. But this pregnant woman, this queen, this empress, she is Kabbalistically associated with the power of multiplication. Multiplication. Now, you know what occurs when any female creature gets pregnant. There's a multiplication starts taking place from the single cell until we have a fully formed creature, a baby, whether it be a little baby fish or a baby tree, whether it be a baby flower or a baby cat, a little kitten, puppy, or an infant. You have this power of multiplication, but what is it that the feminine principle has been multiplying? She's been multiplying the masculine seed. The masculine seed is what she has been multiplying. And woman serves man in this way at all times. She multiplies his seed for him psychologically, emotionally, as well as physically. This is something that has not been understood. Woman is the multiplier for man. Man is the energy producer for woman. Not that we each don't have both, because we do. I mean, every woman has a portion of her that's masculine. Every man has a portion of him that's feminine. But they are sort of reversed in their positive or negative polarity, in their electric or magnetic function of that projection or magnetic bringing in. So that, in essence, when we come to the human family, when we come to man, when we come to the masculine representation of the Divine Father, which we honor today, what we need to recognize on the particular level that we're functioning now in evolution is that every man automatically, by virtue of being a man, projects a certain seed or power to the feminine principle. And depending on his evolutionary level, which includes his discriminatory faculties, his ability to be captured by a discriminating female, shall we say, or discriminating feminine power, to that degree does his seed get multiplied. And the multiplication of this seed becomes what in Kabbalah is called his kingdom, but the kingdom he rules with his queen, the queen being the feminine principle. Now, the way it has actually worked on the whole is that on that unconscious and subconscious level, there have been these developments of hatreds. You know, you always have these feuds going on where man seems to outdo himself. Men get together, and what they seem to need to do more than anything is brag about how many conquests they've made. And it's well known, anyone who has to brag hasn't done a thing. Those who really have made conquests are the ones who are quiet. Those who are secure in their masculinity never have to brag. Most of the bragging isn't true in any case. It's the real quiet ones. You'd be surprised how often I've had very sweet, beautiful, spiritual, quiet men who just emanate a real masculinity. In discussing the subject to try to get more understanding, ask me, is there something wrong with me? Now always it's a highly evolved male that will ask this question to me. Is there something wrong with me? I hear all these men brag about the various conquests and other aspects or details of the expression of the male-female roles. Of course, they use other terms, but I give it to you the way I like to hear it said. And they have said to me, is there something wrong with me? I've wondered whether I'm lacking in as much masculinity as I feel I have. And I've had to smile and say, honey, you got more masculinity in your one little finger than all these braggarts. Anytime you have to brag, you haven't got it. You're insecure. And of course, unfortunately, most men are insecure because of their women. And here's the point. And wherever a man has become negatively attached to the mother image and been unable to keep growing away to make, shall we say, mature relationships with the feminine principle of God, he will be in this conflict where he will automatically be attracting the capturing spirit of the feminine principle that is in harmony with that. In other words, that will really give him a bad time. And of course, if there's anyone who can have a bad time, it's a man, believe me. Although you've heard me say that in past incarnation I was a suffragette. The development of the culture today and the things I've seen occur, I've decided that if I should come back at all, if I decide to come back again, which would be my decision, I'm going to come as a savior of men, not of women. Because men really have become so perplexed on the whole, except for the few. They've become so perplexed they don't know what's the matter. They want to give because it's their compulsion as a spirit of the masculine part of deity. They want to give love. They want to be admired. They want to be adored. Well, who doesn't? But let's say men need it a little more at the beginning, and then women need it a little more when the relationship is, established to a certain degree. At any rate, men have this need to give of themselves. They don't know how to give because they're attracting levels of indiscriminate projection, like certain egomanias, erroneous ideas about what it is to be masculine. In other words, they've taken on the false translations and think that being masculine means, you put your mouth to the side and you have a cigar dangling. I think cigars are beautiful, all right, but I mean, it's the way it would be dangled, and a certain swagger. And, let's us boys go down to the corner and get away from these women. That shows we're men, because we go away together. Let's go off with a gun. And, this is atavistic, because there was a time man had to protect woman and family by going out with instruments to bring food. And you still have this atavistic tendency in most men because they haven't had their women build their self-assurance as men. And so they get kind of desperate. Here's all this energy just absolutely driving them into like an explosion. Because remember, man is more of an exploding energy. Women are bringing this explosion into specific forms. So man has a tendency then to get terribly disturbed because of not being able to feel secure, and he goes out into atavistic types of conduct, like if you go off and kill a few little creatures, that shows you're a man, or if you act brutal, or if you slap a woman's face or somebody and say, "I'm the boss, you listen to me," sort of stuff. A man who knows he's a boss doesn't have to slap anybody, just as a man who's secure doesn't have to brag. And yet, a man needs a woman to be secure, as a woman needs a man to have any meaning in life at all, because she isn't going to be able to perform her functions of multiplying and awakening man to his own inner being. Because here again, man, with his outdriving energies, has a more analytical mentality on the whole, though remember, both have both. But we're talking about the extra concentration. Man has more of this analytical ability that can concentrate every drop of that fabulous energy down into something that is important. And that's why, as I said, we have satellite on the moon, and they'll be going all over the place, all over the solar system, and then God knows what. That's basically man's drive to go outwards, you see. And so all of progress comes from the masculine outward drive, but all of the development and manifestation of it is dependent on the woman's formation of this. Otherwise, everything would go every place and do nothing, you see. And there'd be no development of awareness, consciousness, beingness, individuality, evolution. So we have a mutual dependency between the male and female, between masculine and feminine principle. A dependency far more involved and acute than any realized. And because we've had wrong training, we do not recognize the fact that to the degree we tear down the opposite sex, to that degree are we sterilizing ourselves in accomplishing our own growth, our own evolution, our attainment of union with God, our production of positive things for the entire evolution of this world and life itself. Because if you're going to have the negative and the positive, so-called, or if you're going the electric and magnetic, forever going into these, shall we say, warring factions, which we've had, you have a miserable, lonely, empty, agonized consciousness. And the thing that is very specifically wrong in this particular era is that woman, because she's had a cycle, you know, in all cycles, if a planet is rolling around the sun, sometimes it seems to be on the at one edge of it, say the North Pole of it, and the other time it would be at the South Pole of the thing. And because the feminine principle has had a period in which the masculine principle certainly acted with injustice towards the feminine principle, the rebellion has sort of run away with itself, and for a long, long time we've had the feminine principle trying to destroy the masculine principle's power, which is really self-destruction to her, without her realizing it. And in psychology, it's called the castration principle. So that women say, isn't that like men? Men do this. They're harsh, or they have no understanding of feelings, no understanding of emotions. And so from their own feeling of outrage, which is a long-term thing, really. It goes through many cycles of thousands of years, perhaps. They have a tendency to try to castrate, that is, to demasculinize, to take away the masculinity of their mate, and thereby they actually destroy the very power that they can receive from their mates or their friends, because it isn't necessarily only a mate. It could be a brother, it could be a father, it could be a son, it can be a friend. The masculine-feminine interchanges go on many levels, you know, at all times. But there is this tendency then for each one or the other to say, well, a man is superior. The other say, ha, that's a lot of hooey, woman is superior. And then they go and they write you books about it. And you'll get books from an anthropologist saying the natural superiority of woman, and actually a man wrote it, which is rather charming, but then those who need it, they grab it and say, see, it shows the female principle is superior. And then somebody else will go writing a book and saying, look, after all, woman has only one gene, it's XX, you know, all of her cells are XX. And man, he has more variety, he is XY. You know, woman, she can't decide whether the offspring is going to be male or female, because if the same X mates with her egg, in accordance with her XX, all they get's another girl. I don't know, I think girls are all right, but because it'd be awful if they were only girls, wouldn't it? And so they try to tell you, well, you see, it shows that man is superior to woman because he's XY. Then you have the other faction come back and say, look, the Y part of man's other gene is really a sort of illness. They lost a component, and if you chop a part of the X off, that gives you a Y. So then they say it's a malformed gene. You see all the nonsense they go in for, and believe me, they do this seriously. In all my scientific books that I read, they actually go in for these things seriously. They're as serious about it as the arguments used to go on about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And all they're doing is, again, don't look now, but your consciousness is showing, is all that's really going on, the narrowness of an interpretation. The point is, light and dark, hot and cold, outpouring, inbringing, all of these are the one God in the two aspects of expression. Yod-He-Vav-He, God the Father, is certainly the projecting will and principle of the whole outpouring of the energy of the universe. Elohim is certainly the infilling, the forming, the holding in, the conditioning, developing and multiplying of this outpouring energy. And it is up to woman, it is up to every woman, to love and revere every man, no matter how lowly evolved, or highly evolved, as representing the masculine principle of God, even though she naturally will not get intimately or personally involved with one that, say, is expressing on an infantile level. We attract to ourselves that which we need in our experience, and we have more discrimination when we get into intimate relationships only if we overcome this terrible ambivalence, that ambivalence meaning you love and hate. You see, all women really love men, but they hate them also, except the few highly evolved ones. They hate them also because they have a subconscious realization they are more powerful in certain areas. All men, except the rare highly evolved ones, hate women also, besides loving them, because they know on a subconscious level, even if it isn't conscious, that they are absolutely and utterly dependent on them. And they have this complete requirement. They have to have a place for their energies to be taken in and nurtured. Otherwise, they can't create, really, at all, in the final analysis. Neither can create without the other, as a principle. Even though somebody says, well, I'm a more highly evolved thing, I'm more of a divine androgen, that's nonsense. All over, we have masculine-feminine interaction on all planes of being and life. And even though a woman can be as great a poet and scientist as a man, if she's that interested, it's still an interaction of these principles of the divine, cosmic feminine, cosmic masculine taking place. And man, as such, has to start seeing himself in a more dignified light. It is up to man to make up his mind he is king. It is up to man to see to it that he is treated as such by his mate. And I hope you're paying attention, boys. I mean this seriously. Women receive the energies that are driven at them with love. If energies are driven with hate, they throw back and become destructive. As long as a man has a need to be destructive because of being afraid, and here we come to the crux of the matter, because of being afraid of his own dependency, woman will become outraged and attack him at the very source of his power, his masculinity, his reproductive powers, and she'll do it so subtly that man won't realize what's happening to him. But, on the other hand, remember, man, because he may still be holding, it depends on the evolutionary level, man, because he may still be holding these feelings of guilt, because of childhood negative attachments towards feminine principles like the mother, and there's nothing wrong with the attachment as long as it isn't negative, may continue hitting at a pattern and be using the club, the caveman club, over the woman psychologically without realizing on a conscious level that he does it. So that woman actually helps man to discover his own emotional motivations, which are usually not there for him readily, as they are to woman. Whereas man helps woman to discover this level of objective creativity and analysis and use of the mind and intellect, which expands the manifestation of God in and through man's ability to see the potentials in his outdriving creativeness. That's why you find men are much more creative on the physical plane than women, They really are. Although you have exceptions, naturally. But then a man can't grow a baby inside his womb. She can be so fulfilled within her cellular consciousness that she hasn't got that same drive. But she does provide for man that drive which gives form to the scientific discoveries. For instance, man wouldn't go to work and invent a can opener if his wife wasn't raising hell about how hard it is to open a can. Can't you see this? And he does it both out of love as well as getting intrigued with the problem, as well as having himself captured within an area of a problem that requires a solution. In other words, his creative energy gets captured into, gee, what am I going to do to make this easier so my energy can flow some more? So you see, man gets fulfilled in and through woman's pressures, but the pressures can be for reasons of love or they can be for reasons of hate. And when you have the ambivalence that has the hate level, you have the hells that we have on this planet today. And today, we do not have even remotely the kind of respect for the masculine principle that we should have, and because of that, we haven't got the kind of respect and reverence for the feminine principle that we should have. Man must first decide that he is a lovable being. He must recognize that the divine masculine power flows in and through him. Recognizing this, teaching himself in and through the tarot work that we give you in the lessons you receive at home and the classwork I give you, he starts then to learn how to express the dignified aspect of his own kingship. You know, one of the cutest things, a couple of adorables of mine, a young married couple, she said to me the other day, you know, I always had an expression that I used just without thinking, oh God, oh God. And she said, you know, since I got married, you know, something happens. I say, oh God. He says, yes, dear, were you calling me? Isn't that adorable? Isn't that precious? All right. That's cute, and we all laugh, but do you know this is one of the most constructive things I've ever heard told from a young married couple who love each other and are growing a life? Because that is the secret, really. We, each and every one of us, have to recognize and make up our minds that we are an expression, an aspect of God. We must also respect that which we are enough to see that another treats us with the dignity of what we are by becoming an expression of that ideal. That's where we play the roles in tarot, you know, in order to bring these up into full development. And therefore, I'd like for every one of you, representatives of God, you gorgeous males, every one of you, I mean, no peacock with feathers could compare to the beauty I see in you. What do you think of that? I think it's up to you to see what you are and who you are. And if you can't feel it, work on it with the tarot. Walk in it. Live it. And make your women lovingly, laughingly, but firmly see you and treat you in that manner. And if they haven't got what it takes to do it, then life will start changing the situation, either them or perhaps the mate, which would be sad, but this is what can happen. Remember then, today is Father's Day. Today we honor the masculine principle of God, and when we honor one, we really honor the other, because the masculine principle of God reveres its precious other half on which it is dependent for form and creation and meaningfulness, and also being treated like a baby, which men love even more than women, if that were possible. Use your dignity in such a way that you can demand being babied laughingly and lovingly when you feel you need it. Being catered to, being indulged, and also demand your right to baby and indulge and pet lovingly. In other words, we can command and demand these things only if we feel that sense of love and security here in our hearts. And we have to develop it by deciding we are what we really are. unless you wake up to who and what you are and work on it, you're not going to receive the fulfillment you need. Evolution involves this. The Western culture that holds the Western mysteries for you really involves just this, that you go to work to become and express that beauty. And so when we're through with our little chant and prayer this morning, I insist that every one of you gorgeous representatives of the masculine principle stick your chest out a little more fully, hold your heads up more highly, and be a little more ready to look at woman with the feeling of your kingship and rulership. Okay? Happy Father's Day.